He vanished in 1953. No obituary. No grave. No goodbye. Some say he was a criminal. Others say he was a ghost. But what if he was something else entirely? A man who walked through forgotten towns, carried names he never said aloud, and lit fires he never stayed to warm. For 41 years, he never spoke a word of what happened in that chapel. Not about the woman, not about the blade, not about the night the silence finally broke him. But tonight, with the wind at his back and the world finally quiet, he speaks. And once you hear why he stayed silent all these years, you'll never forget the sound of it. This isn't just a story, it's a confession wrapped in fire, memory, and one final whisper before sleep. So if you're listening in the dark, stay, because what he left behind wasn't just a letter. It was a life, and it might feel a little like yours, the shadow that carried fire. You ever notice how cold teaches you how to listen? That's how I'll begin. If you don't mind, some folks like to start with names or years or where the train stopped, but I've always found the air speaks first. It presses in through the cracks of a wooden frame, settles between the folds of a wool blanket, and lingers behind your teeth when you breathe. I've lived through many winters, but one in particular still visits me when the fire grows low. That was the first time I truly heard the cold, and it heard me back. It was somewhere near the mountains, northern Appalachia, I'd guess now, but back then, it was just the road. I must have been 15, give or take, too old to be held, too young to be missed. The nights dropped into the 20s, and I didn't have proper boots, just a pair of cracked leather shoes with old cloth stuffed in the toes. They squeaked like mice when I walked through frost. I'd found a half-burnt cabin off the side of the trail. No door, just a lopsided frame and a chimney that still breathed smoke if you begged it right. There were 3 logs left in the corner and a bucket of ash, frozen solid. I made myself small and built a nest near the hearth. The trick was staying near the fire without letting it see your whole body, because fire's greedy, and heat goes fast when you ask too much. That night, I didn't sleep, not truly. I lay there watching the orange glow dance on the walls. And for a moment, it felt like company, but the cold was the real presence in the room. Not cruel, just ancient. It wrapped itself around the boards, hummed through the cracks, made every breath visible. You could hear it sigh soft like cotton, but endless. I remember thinking, I'm breathing, and so is the cold. Maybe that's what being alone really means, just you and your breath against everything else. Funny thing was, I didn't feel afraid. Hunger, yes, soreness in every part of me. But fear, no. It was like the night and I had come to an agreement. You stay quiet, I'll stay quiet. You don't move, I won't either. That was the first time I understood how silence could be company. Not the loud kind of silence, where you wish someone would speak, but the full kind. The kind that wraps around your bones and says, this is all there is and it's enough. I'd carried a piece of wool with me, stolen from the back of a horse cart. It still smelled like hay and old apples. I wrapped it around my shoulders and watched the fire lose its color. Little by little, the wood gave out just before dawn, and I sat there, fingers curled like dead twigs. Not thinking anything in particular. That's when I realized something. The cold was teaching me how to breathe, slow, still, accepting, like it wanted me to know that everything, even pain, had rhythm. When morning broke, I walked out and saw the trees all silvered with frost. The sky was that pale kind of blue that only comes when the night's been honest with you. My feet ached, my hands were stiff, but I felt strangely clear, not strong, not hopeful, just aware, like something had noticed me, and for the first time, didn't want anything from me. I found a river down the slope, still crusted in ice, broke a hole with a rock and cupped my hands to drink. It hurt going down sharp, clean pain, but I welcomed it. At least it was real. Sometimes I think that winter gave me more than any summer ever did. It stripped everything soft off of me, but left just enough warmth to carry forward. Like the cold wanted to test me, but not destroy me. Not yet, and maybe that's why I still sit by the fire every night. Because something in me remembers what it meant to be warmed just enough. Not too much, never too much, but just enough to keep breathing. Just enough to keep listening. So if you're still with me, wherever you're listening from, maybe you know that feeling too, of waking to a cold that taught you how to be still. Maybe that's why you're here, Maybe that's why we're here. Do you remember your first winter out on your own? The one where you weren't sure you'd make it through the night, but something afire, a breath, a memory kept you breathing. Tell me where you were. Let's keep this fire going. The yard was always bare in winter. You know how some memories come with a color. This one's gray. Not sad, exactly. Just quiet, like a sky that's forgotten how to shine. That winter, before I ever left, our yard was nothing but frozen dirt and two leaning posts where a fence used to be. No grass, no snow angels. Just the wind curling through bare branches and the crunch of frost when you stepped wrong. There were 5 of us in that little house. Though it always felt like there was less, fewer words, fewer shoes, fewer reasons to open the front door unless you had to. Ma used to hum when it got too quiet. Never a song, just notes soft and slow, like she was coaxing the walls to stay standing. I remember sitting on the back stoop, holding a tin cup that wasn't mine. We'd only had 3 in the house. I don't know where the 4th came from, but I liked the weight of it. Heavy, real, cold on my fingers. Pa had already gone, off looking for work past the ridges. I didn't know if he'd come back, and Ma never said his name. She just moved slower, like the absence of him had settled into her joints. I watched her hang a shirt on the line that day mid-January, cold enough to crack the air, and it froze before the wind even found it. She didn't seem surprised, just stared at it for a while like she was waiting for it to collapse or speak or fly. The house smelled like potatoes and wet wood. Not cooked potatoes, just the raw ones that waited too long to be used. Sometimes I think I associate that scent with being alive, because even in the hunger, even in the thin mattress and shared blanket, we were still there, breathing, listening. My younger brother used to carve shapes into the frost on the window with his fingernail. Little horses, sometimes a tree, once a star. I'd watch him, and he'd pretend he didn't see me. That was how we said I love you back then, through pretending we didn't need each other. We had a cat for a while, Grey. Never named her. She kept the mice out until she ran off, chasing something more certain than we could offer. I don't blame her. Not everything born in a home stays in one. Sometimes, just before dusk, I'd walk to the edge of the yard and stare out past the willow tree. It leaned like an old man watching the ground. I imagined there was something past it worth knowing, but every time I took a step, I heard Ma's voice in my chest saying, "Not yet." It's strange how winter made everything more visible. The cracks in the windows, the way Ma's hands shook when she lit the stove, how every chair creaked differently, depending on who sat where. The silence got louder too. Not empty silence, more like a held breath. Like the house itself was waiting for something to arrive or return or break. And me, I waited too. But I didn't know for what. Maybe just to feel warmer than I was. One evening, I found a blue button in the yard. It was shiny, like it had no business being where it was. I kept it in my pocket for weeks, rubbing it with my thumb when I needed to remember there was still color in the world. Even now, when I dream of home, that button shows up, usually in Ma's hand, sometimes on the floor. Once, I saw her holding it to her heart, like it was something sacred. Maybe it was, the yard was always bare in winter, but bare isn't the same as empty. Sometimes it's just waiting for spring, waiting for a boy to outgrow the stoop, waiting for a memory to grow warm enough to return to. And maybe that's what I'm doing now. Waiting for that button to show up again, waiting for the right note in Ma's hum that finally meant home. Because even now, with fire and food and 4 real mugs in the cabinet, part of me still sits in that yard, holding breath, watching frost, where men went, quiet after supper. They say you can tell what kind of man someone is by how he eats his supper. But I always thought the real truth came after the part where the plates were pushed aside. The room fell still, and the fire crackled with more authority than anyone sitting near it. That's the moment I remember best. Not the meal, but the hush that followed. I must have been 12 or 13 the first time Ma let me walk into the tavern alone. Not to drink, just to sit near the corner stove and learn what stillness sounded like. As she put it, it wasn't a loud place. Not back then, maybe during harvest or war talk, sure. But mostly, it was quiet. Chairs scraped. Wood popped. Men nodded at each other, like that meant something. And it did. Some nights, the room had only 4 or 5 figures in it. Boots muddy, coats steamed from the snow, the kind of silence that didn't ask you to fill it. Just to respect it, old Mr. Klein sat by the door with his pipe, always packing it but rarely lighting it. Said the ritual calmed his mind more than the smoke. He'd lost his youngest in the last flu wave, and though he never spoke of it, you could see the missing in his eyes. It wasn't grief, it was waiting. There was always a checkerboard near the hearth. The pieces were mismatched, some whittled from pine, others just buttons or stones, but no one cheated, and no one kept score. It wasn't about winning, it was about passing the time without spilling anything fragile. A man named Harlan used to hum just under his breath. Not enough to interrupt, just enough to say, "I'm here, but I won't bother you." He worked at the mill, once lost a finger and never cursed about it. Just said, I needed fewer distractions anyway. One night, I watched him pour half his stew into another man's bowl. Said nothing, just nodded once. Slow, like passing a torch in the dark. That's how kindness worked back then, quiet, unannounced, like a warm breath on glass. I remember the way Boots lined up near the fire, pairs of them, dripping onto the stone floor, toes pointed like they had something to say. That was the closest most men came to prayer, warming their souls in silence while their thoughts curled upward with the smoke. Nobody asked questions at the tavern. You could come in limping, covered in blood or sorrow or both, and all you'd get was space, maybe a mug, maybe a nod, but never the question, what happened? That was mercy. In its own way, after a while, I learned how to sit just right, elbows in, eyes lowered, not too still to look nervous, but not so relaxed to seem careless. That's a young man's trick, trying to disappear politely. I wore it like a second skin, and once or twice, just before closing, one of the older men would motion toward me not to speak, just to acknowledge, as if to say, "You've earned your silence tonight." Funny how powerful that can feel. More than a medal, more than applause. You see, supper wasn't just food, it was a surrender, and what came after. That was the reckoning. It was the moment when a man had to sit with whatever he'd done that day. The trees he cut, the lies he told, the debt he couldn't pay. And somehow, the quiet made it easier. Sometimes I wonder what those men would think of now of our noise, our news, our need to speak every grief aloud before it's even ripe. They might think we've lost the art of sitting with ourselves. And maybe they'd be right, but me, I still carry that hush. I light a single flame at supper, I push my plate aside slow, and I listen, because that's when the room speaks back. Not in words, but in warmth, and wood creaks, and the weight of everything left unspoken. The apple woman by the tracks. They say sweetness stays longer in memory when you rarely taste it. And I believe that, because I can still see her, a small woman wrapped in too many shawls, sitting crooked on a splintered bench near the railway tracks. A crate of apples by her feet, a tin mug by her side, and a quiet kindness folded into her lap like old linen. She never sold them like a merchant would. No loud calls, no sharp bargaining, just waited, like the apples would find their people. The first time I saw her, it was late October. The leaves were already dry on the ground, curling like tired hands, and the wind tasted like iron. I was walking from the post barn where I'd been helping with sacks and saddles. Barely earned anything, but enough to stay out of trouble. I hadn't eaten since dusk the day before. There she was, grey braid, soft eyes, hands folded, not young, not frail, just there, still like a clock that no longer ticks, but still keeps the shape of time. I stopped across from her, not saying a word. She looked up slow and gave a little nod, like we were already familiar somehow. Without a word, she reached into the crate, picked out the least bruised apple, and rolled it gently toward me. Didn't toss it, didn't say take it, just gave it. I waited, part of me afraid it was a trick, that she'd ask for coins I didn't have, or worse, my name. But she just sipped from her mug, looked back toward the tracks, and let me decide. I took the apple and held it, didn't bite it, not then. It felt too warm for how cold the world had been. I carried it in my coat pocket all the way back to the wagon shed I was sleeping behind. Held it like a lantern, like proof that someone still noticed boys with no names. I made it last 3 days. Not the fruit, no, that was gone by morning, but the feeling that there was still sweetness in the world that wasn't earned by labor or bought with coin, that someone, somewhere, might still give just to soften the silence. I saw her twice more. Once in early November, hands red from the cold, apples smaller now, the crate half empty. The second time, she had only bruised ones left. I offered to help carry the box back to wherever she came from. She looked at me and said, "Gently, you carry enough already." Then she smiled, not wide, not sad, just a small upturn of the lips, like a leaf finally letting go. After that, she was gone. No one knew her name. Some said she was a widow from Vermont. Others said she'd lost a son in the flood and started giving apples ever since. Me, I think she came from wherever sweetness waits its turn. I still carry apples with me now, not always in my hand, sometimes just in memory, when the cold creeps in, when the fire's low and the silence thickens. I remember the weight of that first red fruit, warm, imperfect, offered, and it reminds me, kindness doesn't shout, it rolls softly across the wood, waits for you to notice, and asks nothing in return. Did someone ever give you something small, without asking who you were or what you had? Just because they saw you? Tell me about that moment. Maybe she gave you an apple, too. Nights were longer by the river bend. You ever notice how some places stretch time? By the river bend, the nights didn't just pass, they lingered, hung in the branches, sank into your bones, refused to leave until they'd carved something into you. That's where I learned how to be still without freezing, how to listen for danger without flinching, and how to breathe like a man who didn't want to be remembered. The river wasn't big more along, tired creek swollen from early snowmelt, but the bend, that curve in the woods, it made a kind of cradle, a pocket of silence that stayed warmer than the rest of the land. That's where I made camp for nearly 2 weeks. No roof, just a slab of driftwood and a half circle of stones I used to protect a weak flame. Some nights, the wind carried cries not animal, not man, just echoes of both. Sounded like someone trying to be brave through a nightmare. I met a man there once, didn't catch his name, didn't ask. He came limping out of the trees with a squirrel slung over his shoulder, wrapped in a shirt like it was sacred. He didn't speak that first night, just pointed to the fire. I moved over, he sat. We shared warmth, not words, and in the morning, he was gone. Left behind half the squirrel, cleaned and wrapped, and a folded note I couldn't read, just a drawing of the river bend and the sun rising over it. It felt like a blessing. I didn't trust many back then. Still don't, if I'm honest. But in that spot, where water curved like a question, something softened in me. Maybe it was the rhythm of the current. Maybe the way the smoke rose in columns instead of chaos. Or maybe it was just the first time I didn't feel hunted by my own thoughts. One night, I counted stars. Didn't mean to. Just kept looking up between logs and breath. Lost count at 58. There was a calm in that failure. A letting go. Not every task needs finishing. Some things are meant to stay unfinished, like grief. Like forgiveness. It was at the riverbend that I started carrying embers. Tucked them in a folded tin can, buried in ash and moss. Learned how to keep them breathing, so I could move fire with me from place to place. There's something about carrying warmth with you that changes how you walk. You become the keeper of something fragile, something worth protecting. It was the first time I thought, maybe I'm not just surviving, maybe I'm keeping something alive. And when the cold grew sharp, and my stomach turned in on itself, I'd press the can to my chest and whisper, "You're still burning, so am I." I left the riverbend when the sky began to change. Clouds pulling longer, air thinner, like the season itself was warning me, keep moving, boy. Before I walked away, I stacked 3 stones in a crooked tower by the edge of the water. Not for anyone to find, just for me, so I'd know I was here once, and that I left something behind that didn't need to be explained. That bend still comes to me in dreams, not as a place, as a rhythm, a space between breaths, a pause between footsteps, a warmth that doesn't belong to fire alone, the blade that found me. It was never mine, not really. The blade, I didn't buy it, didn't ask for it, didn't draw it with some wild idea of becoming anything more than a boy trying to stay warm. It found me, and I've come to believe some things in life do that. They arrive quiet, wrapped in rust and regret, and say nothing except, "You'll need me now." The morning it appeared, I was digging through a burnt-out wagon. Some fool had tried to outrun a storm across the valley and lost half his load to fire and mud. I wasn't looting, just salvaging, for warmth, for teen, for anything that could be bartered for bread. And there it was, stuck in a cracked saddlebag beneath a charred plank. A short blade more like a thick carving knife than a weapon, wood handle, half wrapped in cord, steel nicked and worn but still steady. It didn't gleam, didn't hum like they say in stories. It just sat there, waiting. I didn't take it right away. Something in me hesitated. Like touching it would mean signing something I couldn't read. But the wind was rising, and the snow came sharp that day. So I wrapped it in burlap, slid it into my coat, and walked away without looking back. I didn't use it at first, not for days, just kept it close, checking to see if it was still there, like a secret I wasn't sure I deserved. Sometimes, when the fire died early, or the hunger scratched louder than sleep, I'd feel the blade's weight and think, you could end your story or fight for one. I never said those words aloud, but the thought sat beside me all the same. Then came the wolf, or something like it. Thin, ragged, desperate like me. It didn't attack, just watched, circling the edge of the camp like it was waiting for me to give up. I could feel my ribs then sharp as fence posts and knew I had nothing left to offer. That night, I held the blade in my hand for the first time. Didn't strike, didn't threaten, just let it rest in my palm until the animal turned and vanished into the dark. That's when I realized the blade wasn't for killing, not yet. It was for remembering I still had hands, still had choices, still had weight. I carved my first fire stake with it the next morning, split kindling with more control, cut thread from my boots to patch a tear. It wasn't a weapon, not yet, it was survival. Over time, the handle shaped to my grip, or maybe my hand shaped to it. Hard to say, but it felt familiar, not like a friend, more like a scar you stop noticing. I kept it wrapped in cloth, tied to the inside of my coat, always touching chest, always near the thrum of breath, because somewhere deep, I'd come to believe, as long as the blade stayed warm, so would I. How a boy becomes smoke. You don't wake up one day and realize you've disappeared. That's not how fading works. It happens slowly, so quietly you don't even notice at first. You start talking less, choosing quieter footsteps, walking behind buildings instead of down main roads. It's not that you mean to vanish, it's just that being unseen starts to feel safer than being misunderstood. I remember the moment I felt it though, not all at once, and not with any drama. It was behind the old water tower on the edge of town. A group of men were bartering for wool and salt under the grey sky. I was just passing through, eyes low, breath slow. One of them looked up, paused, and then glanced away like I was just another shadow leaning against the wind. And the strange part, it didn't hurt. It felt right. Like maybe I'd finally matched the way I felt inside. That's how smoke begins, not with a scream, but with a quiet agreement between you and the world. An understanding that you'll stop asking questions if they stop expecting answers. There's something peaceful about learning to disappear. You stop needing to explain yourself. You start walking softer, speaking only when the words feel worth the breath they cost. You fold yourself into corners that don't ask anything of you. And slowly, the boy you were, he starts fading too. You forget the way he laughed, the way he waited for someone to call his name. He becomes someone you almost remember. Sometimes I'd find myself near people, but not with them, sitting on the edge of a gathering, just far enough to feel the warmth of the fire, but not close enough to be offered a plate. They'd glance at me, unsure, and I wouldn't say anything to change their minds. It was easier that way. Being quiet felt like control, silence. In those days, felt like survival. I stopped walking like a boy. I started moving like smoke soft, silent, slipping through spaces no one else used. The blade I carried wasn't drawn often, but I knew its weight. I knew where it rested. It wasn't for harm, not yet. It was a reminder that I could shape the world if I needed to, that I still had weight, even if no one else noticed. One night, in an empty train shed outside Fayette, I caught my reflection in a broken mirror. The glass was stained, cracked from corner to corner, but I could still see enough. My face was thinner, my eyes darker. Not older, just quieter, like someone had taken the sound out of them. I didn't look like I used to, but more than that, I didn't look like I belonged anywhere. That was the first time I realized I hadn't just disappeared from the world. I had disappeared from myself. I'd stopped dreaming, too. That's something no one tells you about living like a shadow. The dreams go first, then the laughter, then the memory of your own name when someone finally says it. You learn to carry warmth in smaller ways: a scrap of bread, a dry patch of wall, the steady beat of your own heartbeat in the silence. You tell yourself that's enough, and for a while, it is. But even smoke wants to be remembered. Even smoke misses the shape of fire. I remember standing under a bridge near Allendale, rain pounding like footsteps, watching the town lights blink through the trees. I'd just passed through without being noticed. No shelter, no meal, no words exchanged, and instead of feeling lost, I felt proud because I had become something the world couldn't hold. I could move without trace. I could survive without help. I could vanish without anyone realizing I'd been there. That's how a boy becomes smoke. Not in a single night, and not by choice, but by learning to survive in silence, to trust the quiet more than the sound, to become soft where the world is sharp. And still, somewhere beneath it all, I wanted someone to see me again, not for what I'd become, but for who I was before the wind carried me away. The man who taught me to mend rope. He never told me his real name. I doubt he remembered it himself. To most, he was just the rope man, or sometimes that old fella by the split rail, if they spoke of him at all. But to me, he was the first soul in a long while who looked at me and didn't flinch, didn't ask questions, didn't pull their coat tighter like I was made of wind and warnings. He lived near the edge of what used to be a river port, nothing grand, just a sagging shed with netting for walls and ropes stacked in loops like sleeping snakes. I found him there on a day when the rain had turned the roads into soup and my souls into ghosts. I was just looking for somewhere dry, maybe a corner I could borrow for the night. He didn't raise his voice when he saw me, just nodded at the back wall and said, "You sleep where the rope don't curl," like it was the most natural thing in the world to offer a stranger shelter among tools and twine. I stayed for 3 nights, might have been 4. Time didn't matter much back then, only the weather and how sharp your hunger spoke. The old man didn't ask what I was running from. He didn't need to. He had the kind of eyes that had already seen every kind of running there was. Eyes that had waited on the edge of too many dawns for someone who never came back. Instead of questions, he gave me work. Small things at first. Coil this, untangle that, patch the net, clean the rust from the blade of his hook knife. He didn't praise, didn't correct, just handed over the task and expected it done with care. And slowly, I learned the rhythm of his world. Mending rope isn't just about knots and strength, it's about memory. Every strand tells you where it's been salt-worn from the coast, sun-dried from cattle drives, scorched in places where lightning found it before men did. You don't fix rope, you listen to it. You respect what it's already endured, and you try to keep it useful a little longer. I remember one night, the wind slipping through the netting like fingers across a piano. He showed me how to weave a splice into a frayed end. My hands were clumsy, cold, but I was trying. He watched for a long while without saying anything, then finally muttered, "You pull too fast when you're afraid. Rope don't like fear, it tightens wrong." That line stayed with me, not just about rope, but about me. I pulled too fast when I was afraid. I made decisions like I was running downhill with no brakes, grabbing what I could, trusting nothing, preparing always for the worst. But with the rope, I had to be patient. I had to breathe. I had to trust the thread would hold if I handled it like it wanted to be held. And maybe, in some strange way, that's what the old man was teaching me all along. Not how to fix rope, but how to stop unraveling myself. He never said anything profound, never told stories of who he was before the nets and the dock and the weathered hands. But I could see it in the way he worked, the way he hummed when he tied a proper hitch, the way he sat by the fire with his shoulders forward, like he still expected someone to come through the curtain of night and say, "I'm back," on my last morning there. I tried to thank him. I stood with my pack in my hand and the blade tucked against my ribs and mumbled something about learning and kindness. He just shrugged and said, "Mend what you can, cut what won't," then turned back to his coil of weathered line like the moment hadn't happened. I walked away slower than usual that day, Not because my feet were sore, but because it's hard to leave someone who never asked anything of you except that you be gentle with the things you touched. And maybe, just maybe, with yourself, have you ever met someone who didn't ask who you were, but showed you who you could still be? Someone whose silence healed more than advice ever could? If so, tell me how they mended you, one knot at a time. There's a kind of silence that lives inside certain letters, not the sort you send with stamps or seal with wax, but the ones you carry around in your thoughts, half written, folded quietly behind your ribs. They're the letters you start without knowing how they'll end. They live between breaths, between regrets, between the kind of nights when sleep forgets your name and the wind feels like it's asking a question you can't quite answer. I started one of those letters 3 winters ago, in a boarding house just past Ohio Ridge, a place that smelled of kerosene and old quilts, the kind where the windows were always fogged and the stairs remembered every foot that ever touched them. I hadn't planned to stay long, just needed a place to warm my boots and dry out the inside of my coat. The innkeeper didn't ask where I'd come from or why I looked more like a shadow than a guest. She just pointed to the corner near the firebox and said, "You don't snore, do you?" That's where I slept. Not quite out of the cold, but not quite in the world either. I remember the heat of the bricks under my spine, the smell of scorched wood in my sleeves, the sound of rain tapping the eaves like it was keeping time with my heart. That's when I wrote her name down again. Elira. I used the edge of a broken pencil and the back of an old candle wrapper. That was all I had. Her name came out crooked, like it wasn't used to being spoken anymore. I whispered it once, soft, like a prayer or a secret or something halfway between the two. Her name didn't echo in that room, it just settled. She wasn't mine. Never really was. Elira belonged to bread dough rising on windowsills, to aprons stitched with patience, to the smell of cloves, and the way her laughter always landed a beat behind her smile. She belonged to early light and kitchen songs, to porches in spring and warm hands brushing flour off the cheek of someone she loved. And I wasn't that someone not for long, not in the way that mattered when the nights turned hard and long. But memory doesn't need permission. It shows up anyway. And that night, in the soft hush of half sleep and hearth smoke, I started writing to her, not as a way to return, but as a way to remain somewhere, somehow. I didn't start the letter with "Dear Elira." That felt too far from the truth. I tried other openings. You would have laughed at the way the snow sticks here. Or, "Do you still hum when you're alone in the kitchen?" But none of them fit right. So I just began with a story, something small. Today, I saw a boy chase a moth like it was a butterfly. He caught it, held it gently, and then let it go. That made me think of you. And that's what most of the letter became, little stories. Little moments I tucked away like smooth stones in my coat pocket. I told her about a woman in a mining town who made soup from nothing but onions and kindness. How her broth warmed more than my stomach. I told her about the man who taught me to mend rope, and how he showed me that frayed things still have use if you're willing to listen to them. I told her about a fire I built under the stars in Missouri, and how for one night, the smoke curled upward, like it was reaching for something it had lost. I told her about the blade I kept close, not because I wanted to use it, but because sometimes survival needs a weight in your hand to remind you you're still here. I never said I missed her, not directly, but every word in that letter was an echo of what I couldn't bring myself to say. That I missed the way she looked at me like I wasn't broken yet. That I missed the way she made space for quiet. That I missed being someone who belonged somewhere. The letter grew. I wrote on bits of paper, the back of a receipt, the corner of an old ledger. I kept them folded in layers, like I was trying to protect something fragile from time. I'd take them out now and then, read them by firelight or lamplight, sometimes aloud, sometimes just mouthing the words as if saying them too loud might wake the pain. And then one day, while walking along a creek near an abandoned rail stop, I reached into my coat to read the letter again and found that it had torn. Right through the middle, right through her name. The ink had bled where the rain had found it. The corners were softened, nearly dust. I stood there for a long time, holding it like a broken photograph. Then I knelt by the creek and folded what was left beneath a flat stone, right where the water whispered like a lullaby. I didn't cry, I didn't speak. I just watched as the current kissed the edges of that stone and moved on. Some letters aren't meant to be sent. Some stories are just for the telling. And sometimes, speaking a name into the wind is the only way to remind yourself you're still someone who remembers. There are nights you survive because of what you do. And then there are nights you survive because of what you refuse to do, even when the cold is louder than reason and your stomach feels like it's trying to eat its own silence. This was one of those nights. It was somewhere near the New York state line, just past a town too small to remember and too quiet to forget. The kind of place where the porch lights hum even after midnight, and you can hear the snow fall before you feel it. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, unless you count the half apple I found near a cart of spoiled fruit, already soft with frost and bruises. I was tired, my boots soaked through, and I was starting to feel that strange hollow in my chest that isn't quite hunger and isn't quite despair, but something in between. Like your body's way of whispering, "You're fading." And that's when I saw it. The bakery cart. It was parked behind a shop, half covered in tarp, its wheels crusted in ice. No one watching. No dog. No lock. Just a crate of loaves still warm. I could smell them before I saw them. Cinnamon. Rye. One that must have been made with molasses. The kind that used to stick to the corners of your mouth as a boy. I stepped closer without thinking. My hand moved to the edge of the tarp. It wasn't even guilt I felt. It was instinct. Like reaching for fire when you're cold, not for the danger, but for the chance it might remember your name. And yet, I stopped. Not because I was afraid. Not because I thought someone might see. No one would, but because, just above the car, there was a small window cracked open, and through it, I heard a child laughing. Soft, muffled, close. It was the kind of laugh that happens when someone finds joy without knowing they're being watched carefree, belly deep, true. And in that moment, I knew that bread wasn't mine. That joy belonged to someone who still had it, and I wasn't about to be the shadow that took it away. So I stepped back, pulled my coat tighter, turned away. The wind punished me for it, came sharp down the alley, biting through every patch I'd sewn on my sleeves, slicing across my cheeks like it was asking, "What are you?" if not desperate. And I didn't answer, because I didn't know. All I knew was that I didn't want to be the kind of man who took bread from the hands of a laughing child, even if I never heard that laugh again. Even if I collapsed from hunger before sunrise. I slept in a barn that night, or tried to, curled beside the rear axle of a rusted-out wagon. I kept replaying that moment, my hand on the tarp, the smell of bread, the sound of that laugh, and the truth was, it didn't make me feel righteous. It made me feel human, like something inside me still remembered what it meant to choose grace over survival. In the dark, I ran my fingers over the handle of the blade tied to my chest. It felt colder than usual, like it too had felt the hunger and the choice. I whispered to it, not like a weapon, but like a friend who'd been with me longer than I wanted to admit. I didn't take it. I said. The words disappeared into the barn rafters like breath on glass. I could have, but I didn't. And somewhere in the quiet that followed, I swear the wind softened. Just a little. By morning, my fingers were stiff, my knees aching, and my stomach hollow, but I was still here. And when I stepped out into the frost-heavy dawn, I saw something tucked beneath the old wagon wheel, a cloth napkin, folded. Inside, a single heel of bread, still warm, still soft. Someone had seen me, someone had heard the silence of not stealing, and they'd answered not with punishment, not with judgment, but with kindness. I never found out who it was, never returned to that town, but I've carried that moment with me ever since. More than any coin I've earned, more than any warmth I've borrowed. Because that night, I didn't just survive, I chose to. And sometimes, when the wind howls and the cold comes sharp, and I'm tempted to grab what isn't mine, I remember that laughter and the heel of bread I didn't steal. The one job I regret. It wasn't my first job in the shadows, and it wouldn't be my last, but it was the one that never quite let go of me. Funny thing about regret, it doesn't shout. It doesn't slam doors or break mirrors. No. Real regret, deep, slow-burning regret, it whispers. It lingers in the hallway when you think you're alone. It leans against the far side of the firelight and waits for your breath to falter. And on certain nights, like this one, It settles beside you like an old companion who never learned when to leave. The job was meant to be simple. Just a message, they said, a warning, delivered to a man who owed more than he could pay, in more ways than coin could count. I wasn't supposed to hurt him, just scare him, make sure he understood that debts, in our world, didn't go unpaid forever. I'd done worse. To my shame, I'd taken jobs where silence came after blood. But this one felt different, even before I arrived. His name was Thomas Welling, ran a boarding house out near the edge of the Carolina Pine Belt. Widow, raised 2 daughters on his own after a flood took his wife and half the town with her. He was the kind of man who still sang hymns under his breath when he thought no one could hear. The kind who fixed things that weren't his, just because it bothered him to see anything broken. I didn't know any of that when I rode in. All I had was a name, a location, and a time to knock. It was late, nearly midnight, when I reached the front porch. Cold enough that the wind scraped along the shingles, like it was trying to remember a song it once knew. I stood there for a while, hand tucked into my coat, rehearsing the words they told me to say. Simple phrases, meant to rattle a man's bones, make him feel the cold from the inside out. But then the door opened, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with warmth. And standing there wasn't some hardened debtor or defiant fool. It was a girl, couldn't have been more than 12, auburn hair braided with care. She looked up at me with eyes that hadn't yet learned to flinch. "You here for a room?" she asked, like I was nothing more than a traveler in need of a roof. Behind her, I saw Thomas. He was older than I'd pictured, not by age, but by time. The kind of age that settles in your shoulders after too many winters and too many nights, trying to fix what the world had broken. But his eyes were steady. He saw me, saw something in me, and instead of closing the door, he nodded. "Cold out," he said. "Come in if you need to warm your hands." It wasn't a trick, wasn't a test, just kindness. That quiet, ordinary kindness that feels louder than thunder when you've gone too long without it. I stepped inside, sat by the hearth while the girl brought me a chipped mug of coffee, thick and bitter, and just hot enough to thaw the tips of my fingers. Thomas didn't ask my name, didn't ask my business. He just sat in the chair across from me and watched the fire with the kind of silence that felt more like company than absence. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't say the words I'd been sent to say, because suddenly they felt like rust in my mouth, like dragging a blade across a linen tablecloth. Out of place, unnecessary, wrong. So I left, told him I'd stopped for directions, thanked him for the coffee, walked out into the wind and didn't look back until I was half a mile away. And even then, I could still see the flicker of his porch light, warm against the cold. I thought that would be the end of it. But a week later, I heard the debt collector sent someone else, someone colder, someone who didn't sit by the fire. Thomas was beaten, not killed, thank God, but broken enough that he had to sell the boarding house. The girls were sent to live with distant kin, and the porch light never came on again. And that's the part that haunts me. Not that I walked away, but that I didn't warn him, that I didn't say, "Leave now, take your girls, run while there's still time." I'd seen enough of that world to know what silence buys, and yet I stayed silent, not out of fear, but out of some twisted sense of mercy. I told myself that sparing him the fear was better than sparing him the pain. But that's not how life works, not in the shadows. And so now, every time I pass a house with its porch light on, I remember him. I remember the smell of firewood and the weight of that chipped mug. I remember a little girl's voice asking if I needed a room. And I remember the man who offered me warmth, who deserved better than what I brought to his door. There's only one job I regret, and it's the one I didn't finish. Have you ever failed someone, not by what you did, but by what you didn't do? A word you didn't say, a warning you kept quiet. If that silence still walks beside you, you're not alone. Tell me what you carried and never put down. The empty chapel on Maple Hill. Some places don't carry their age in years, they carry it in dust. In silence, in the way the light filters through broken glass, as if even sunlight remembers to step softly. The chapel on Maple Hill was one of those places. I hadn't meant to find it, wasn't on any map I carried. But sometimes, the road leads you to memories you don't remember making. Sometimes, it's the land that remembers you first. It was early spring when I stumbled upon it. Not the kind of spring with flower baskets and painted shutters, but the kind where winter still lingers in the soil, where the grass comes back in patches and the air smells like thawed regret. I was following a deer trail through the woods north of Lancaster, trying to keep off the main road. Not because anyone was chasing me, but because quiet had become my only trusted companion. And then I saw it, half sunken into the hill. Shingles rotted, steeple leaning slightly to the left, like a man who's heard too many hard truths. The door was gone, eaten away by years of wind and rain. The sign above the arch had faded into a blur of once intended faith. But inside, there was still a hush, a holy kind of hush. I stepped in. The floor groaned like it was trying to remember how to welcome footsteps. Dust danced in the light shafts. The pews, though cracked and splintered, still stood in rows, like tired old men waiting to be acknowledged. And at the far end, where an altar once stood, there was only a wooden crate covered in candle wax and a folded cloth frayed at the edges, but carefully placed, like someone still came here to pray. I sat, right there, in the second pew, and I listened, not for voices there were none, but for something else. The sound of absence, the sound of everything that had once filled this place and now echoed in its leaving. I didn't pray, not with words, but my body settled the way it used to when I was a boy in church, hands on knees, shoulders forward, eyes soft. I remembered my mother's voice humming the same tune every Sunday, even when she had no voice left to sing. I remembered how my father used to nod along, not quite singing, not quite silent, just present. Funny thing, I hadn't thought of them in weeks, maybe months, but in that empty chapel, they felt as close as breath. And then I saw the carving on the back of the pew in front of me, etched deep by a patient hand. Forgive the ones who left before they could stay. It was faint, worn down by time and weather and reverence. But it struck me like a bell, because if I'd had a prayer in me that day, it might have sounded like that. I don't know how long I sat there. Might have been an hour, might have been the whole afternoon. The sun had shifted by the time I stood, casting new shadows across the wooden floor. I walked slowly to the front, ran my fingers over the candle wax pooled on the crate, traced the shape of a rusted nail where a cross must have once hung. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I sang just a single verse, a lullaby my mother used to hum when I'd fall asleep by the stove. My voice cracked halfway through. Age and weather had taken parts of it I didn't realize were missing, but the notes were still there, hidden in my chest like seeds waiting for spring. And for a moment, I didn't feel alone. That's the thing about empty places, they hold on to echoes. They carry the warmth of every hand that ever touched their walls, every tear that ever hit their floors, every laugh that once rang out under their roofs. Even when no one's left to hear, the place remembers. I left a coin on the crate, not out of habit, not out of guilt, but because it felt right, like saying thank you to a room that had held my memory without being asked. Outside, the sky was starting to dim. The trees whispered overhead, and as I walked away, I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to, but because some places are better remembered in your chest than in your eyes. And that chapel, that quiet, tired, beautiful chapel on Maple Hill, it reminded me that I hadn't lost my soul, just misplaced it for a while, the choice that splintered the flame. There comes a moment in every wandering life when you must choose, not between right and wrong, but between the road that forgets and the fire that remembers. And I stood at that crossroads one rain-heavy night, somewhere between Missouri's river fog and a man's fading belief that he could still come home. They'd offered me a job, not the usual kind, not one that paid in coin or bread or places to lay my head. This job was personal. It came from someone I once trusted, a man named Cutter, though I doubt that was ever his real name. Back when we worked together, he was sharper than the blade he kept tucked in his boot. He didn't raise his voice, didn't sweat, didn't hesitate. Cutter moved through the world like a shadow that already knew the ending. He found me outside a campfire on the edge of a lumber town. I hadn't seen him in over a year. I'd left that life behind, or thought I had. But shadows, they find each other. Even when you try to walk into the light, he said the job was clean, simple. It's just a man. He told me he's not innocent, and he won't be missed. That's what they always say. But then Cutter added something I didn't expect. He told me the man Armark was the reason Elira had fled the valley. Elira! I hadn't heard her name spoken aloud by anyone else in nearly 5 years. It hit me like a stone dropped into still water. Every ring of memory rippled out. I listened. Eyes low, breath slow. Cutter spoke like it was just business. But I knew better. He'd been there. He'd seen what that man did, the power he held over families. Over women like Elira, over whole towns too scared to speak. This was no revenge fantasy, no drunken promise. This was justice, or something close to it. And the strange thing was, it made sense. It made so much damn sense. But something in me stalled. Not out of mercy, not even fear. It was something colder than either, something harder to name. I think if I'm honest, it was because I'd just begun to remember how it felt to be warm. That chapel on Maple Hill, the heel of bread, the sound of my own voice cracking through an old lullaby. I'd started to feel human again, and taking this job, this final shadowed thing, it would unmake that. So I asked Cutter to give me the night. He lit a match with his thumbnail and held it up to his cigarette like he was offering fire to the night itself. He nodded. "One night," he said. "Then you choose," and so I walked. Not far, just enough to let the trees close around me. Just enough to hear my own thoughts again. The moon was high, but shy behind a veil of clouds. The forest floor crackled underfoot. Somewhere nearby, a creek whispered secrets to itself. I found a fallen log and sat, hands open, empty, and I tried to picture it. What it would feel like to do it, to take justice into my own hands. To right a wrong Elira never spoke aloud but always carried in her eyes. Would it bring peace? Would it bring anything? The truth is, I wasn't sure. But then I did something I hadn't done in a long while. I built a fire, just a small one, enough to keep my hands busy, enough to watch the flames dance and remember what they'd once meant to me. Because fire doesn't care who you are. It gives heat, it takes air, it flickers, it consumes, it remembers nothing, but invites everything. And as I watched the flames curl and crackle, I thought about all the moments that had led me here. Not the big ones, not the violent ones, but the quiet ones. The heel of bread, the carved pew, the sound of Elira's humming under the early morning light. And I thought, if I do this, what part of me survives afterward? The fire didn't answer, but it didn't have to, because I already knew the man I'd become, this shadow, this ghost wandering from porch to pew to barn to silence, he could do the job. But the man who knelt beside a girl's laughter and chose not to steal, the man who wept beside a pew and sang to a memory of his mother, that man couldn't, so I let the fire burn out, piece by piece. And when the last ember died, I buried the ashes with my own hands. In the morning, I found Cutter by the river, sharpening his blade. "I'm not going." I told him. He didn't blink. "I figured," he said. Then he handed me the blade he'd been sharpening, held it out like an offering. "Then take this," he said. "For when someone else comes asking." I took it, not because I wanted it, but because sometimes the hardest part of leaving the shadows is knowing they don't always leave you. When the wind carried her voice, the first time I heard her voice again, it wasn't really her, it was the wind. But the wind, in certain places, doesn't just rattle branches and whistle through gaps in old cabins. It remembers things. It carries the syllables of people long gone, phrases left half-spoken, names folded in the breath between winter and spring. And on that day, walking along the edge of a red clay road near the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains, I swear clear as bells, gentle as birdsong, I heard her say my name. Not loud, not pleading, just like she was still near. Samuel, that was all. And just like that, everything I'd buried, the warmth, the ache, the memory of her hand brushing mine that last morning in the valley, it rose. I stopped mid-step, couldn't breathe for a moment. The trees stood still, almost respectfully. A single feather fell from the pine above, spiraling down like it had been waiting for this very silence. I hadn't seen Elira in nearly 6 years, but that voice, that soft hush of a voice, had never quite left me. It was the kind of sound that stayed in your coat, like smoke, or the last note of a lullaby she used to hum while shelling peas. She never knew she did it. I'd catch her on the porch, Barefoot, hair pinned back with a single twig, the late sun glinting off her arms. She hummed the way some people breathe, just part of being alive. And even now, even after all the roads I'd taken and all the names I'd worn that weren't mine, her humming still lived in the corners of my quiet. I kept walking, not because I wasn't shaken, but because when the wind speaks like that, you don't argue, you follow. The road curved, dipped through a grove of wild dogwoods just starting to bud. Their petals looked like they were holding their breath, waiting for the frost to pass. I moved slow, hand brushing each branch, like they might remember her too. I found the place by accident, or maybe not. It was a small hollow near the base of a hill, with a trickling stream and an old bench made from split rail. Moss had grown over its legs, and the seat had cracked down the middle, but it still stood, and carved into the backrest faint. Weathered was a name, Illyra. No surname. Nodate, just her name. I sat down. The wood creaked beneath me, and for a moment, I imagined her beside me again, knees close. Breath even. Her voice just behind my ear saying, "You finally found it. We used to talk about places like this, back when the world still seemed soft around the edges. When dreams felt like things you could store in jars and line up on a shelf." She wanted a garden, a porch swing, a tree that grew crooked just enough to make the house feel loved. I remember once she said, "If I'm ever gone, find the place where the dogwoods wait. I'll be there." And I hadn't remembered that sentence, not fully. Not until the wind said my name. I closed my eyes, let the breeze carry the sound of water and leaves, let it press against my coat like her arms once did. For a moment, I didn't feel like the man I'd become. I felt like the boy who once promised her he'd never carry a blade, who used to chase her laughter through the tobacco fields, who thought love could save us both. Funny thing about memory, it doesn't age, it just waits. And here, in this hollow beneath the dogwoods, the years melted. I didn't see scars or silence or the long nights I'd spent chasing coin through cold alleys. I saw her, and she saw me, not with judgment, but with that same quiet knowing she always had. Like she'd always known I'd come back, eventually, when the road was done, teaching me how to lose. I don't know how long I sat there. Might have been minutes, might have been hours. But when I finally stood, I felt lighter, not healed, but softer. I pulled the old blade from my coat, the one Cutter gave me, the one that had kept me warm and fed and afraid. And I left it there, tucked under the bench. No ceremony, no farewell, just placed it down like you'd place a stone on a grave, not out of anger, but out of love, because some burdens don't belong on your back forever. Some are meant to rest, to rust, to become part of the earth again. And as I walked away, the wind shifted. It didn't say my name this time, but it didn't need to, because now I was listening for something else entirely. Some words are too heavy to say out loud, so you write them instead. I carried that letter for nearly 4 winters, tucked behind the inside lining of my coat, close to the skin, folded twice, ink smudged from sweat and rain. I'd pull it out sometimes, never to read, just to feel the weight of it again. To remember that once I still believed in the kind of truth that could fit on paper. I wrote it the night I saw Elira leave. It was just past midnight, the kind of hour when even regrets sleep. I'd heard the soft slam of the barn door, then the hush of her boots on wet grass. She didn't know I was awake. I didn't call after her, because I'd already failed her by then. Not in some grand, cinematic way, but in all the little silences, all the times I chose quiet instead of comfort, distance instead of questions, the way I made shadows feel safer than fire. That night, after she was gone, I sat at the edge of our old cot with nothing but the faint orange flicker of the oil lamp and the scent of tobacco and rain-soaked wood. My hands shook when I picked up the pen, not from cold, from knowing the truth was already too late. But I wrote anyway. Her name came first, Elira. I wrote it slow, like saying a prayer. Then I told her everything I should have said when she was still within reach, that I'd followed her voice before I ever followed my own. That I loved the way she traced the rim of her coffee mug when thinking, that she made silence feel full, not empty, that I knew I'd disappointed her, that I knew why she left, and that, even if she never came back, I'd carry her voice like a compass tucked beneath my ribs. And then I wrote something I wasn't sure I believed yet. If you ever forgive me, leave something where only the wind can find it. It wasn't a request. It was a hope, because I didn't deserve an answer, only a chance to be reminded that the good in me hadn't drowned completely. I never sent that letter, not because I didn't mean it, but because part of me feared she'd already moved on, that she'd built a new porch with new laughter, and that my words would only rattle loose something she'd worked hard to bury. So I kept it, carried it with me through dry deserts and cold taverns, through bad jobs and good silences, and every time I thought I might finally burn it, something stopped me. A bird call, a half-hummed tune, a porch swing creaking in a town that looked like hers. The letter became a part of me like a scar, or a story no one else knows but still shapes the way you walk. I never dared open it again. Maybe I was scared the ink had run, or worse, that the words would no longer feel like mine. Then one day, this was 2 years after the Dogwood Hollow, I passed through a tiny rail town on the edge of the Missouri floodplain. One of those towns where the buildings lean from too many storms, and the signs are hand-painted because no one's bothered to make new ones in decades. I was thirsty, dust in my teeth. I stopped at a corner store that sold lemonade by the ladle. The old woman behind the counter wore a brooch shaped like a star and smelled like mint and cedar. She didn't ask questions, just poured me a tin cup and said, "You've got the look of someone who's waited for too long." I don't know why, but I reached into my coat, pulled out the letter, held it for a beat, and then I left it. Right there on her wooden counter. Didn't explain, didn't sign it, just folded it once more and slid it beneath the tip jar. She looked at it, then looked at me and nodded like she understood more than she let on. "You sure?" she asked, voice soft. I just smiled. It's time the wind carried it instead of me. And I walked out. That was 2 summers ago. I haven't carried the letter since, but some nights, when the wind is right, when it brushes the shutters, just so I like to think it made its way to her. Maybe not to her hands, but to a place she once loved. A stream, a garden, a chapel door, and maybe, just maybe, she picked up something one day, something small, folded, forgotten by most, and felt that ache of almost recognition, the kind that says, "You were never forgotten." Only carried, the stranger who called me home. It's strange how the kindest words sometimes come from the mouths of strangers, not from those you shared porches with or passed bread to in dim-lit kitchens, but from someone you've never seen before and might never see again. I met her at a roadside orchard, just outside a Pennsylvania town that didn't have a name worth remembering. The kind of place that grew apples for no one in particular, where the trees leaned a little too far west from years of stubborn wind, and the crates were always a little too splintered. I'd stopped there not for the apples, but for the quiet, something about orchards. They carry silence like an old tune, the way wind hushes through the leaves, the way the branches sway like they're remembering dances from long ago. It's hard not to sit still under their watch. She was there, already seated on the tailgate of a rusted truck, peeling an apple with a knife so thin and worn. It looked like it belonged in a museum of forgotten meals. Her hands were weathered, but graceful. Her boots were laced loose, like she never planned to walk far, but had wandered anyway. I nodded a hello, slow and easy. She looked up, gave me a glance that held neither curiosity nor fear, just quiet acknowledgement. Like 2 clouds passing. "You from here?" I asked, mostly to fill the air. She shook her head. Never from anywhere long enough to answer that honestly. That made me smile. I sat on a stump nearby, careful not to crack it. She offered me a slice of apple without asking my name. It tasted of sunlight, age, and something like honey left too long in the cupboard. We didn't talk for a while, just listened to the rustle, the bees, the creak of old branches sighing. But then, as if we'd been mid-conversation all our lives, she asked, "How long you been running?" I blinked, not because the question surprised me, but because of how gently she'd asked it. Not like someone demanding truth, like someone offering permission. I looked down at my boots, caked with dry mud from towns I'd already forgotten. "Longer than I meant to," I said. "Maybe forever." She nodded, peeled another apple. I ran for 27 years. Then I stopped, sat right there under that crooked tree, and decided I was done chasing silence. I didn't say anything, Just let her words settle. Then she looked at me again, this time softer. "Thing about silence," she said. "It's only peaceful when you stop using it to hide." That one landed hard. Because it was true, my silence hadn't been peaceful. It had been armor, a disguise, a place to keep shame tucked beneath polite nods and well-worn coats. She set her knife down, then asked, "You got anyone calling you home?" I swallowed, thought about Illyra, thought about the chapel, the carved pew, the letter, the wind. "No," I said, "not anymore." She studied me a moment, not with pity, with recognition. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Well, if no one's calling, maybe it's time you did." I didn't know what to make of it at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. All these years I'd been waiting for someone to say, "Come home," waiting for a voice, a letter, a sign. But maybe that voice was supposed to be mine all along. Maybe we carry the map back to ourselves inside us. And all it takes is saying the words, even if no one else hears. I asked her name before I left. She just smiled. "You don't need it," she said. "Some people are meant to pass through like songs, beautiful for a while, then gone." I nodded. And as I walked away, I turned back one last time, just to see if she was real. She was gone. The truck was still there. The apple peels too, but no sign of her. And the air felt different, like something old had lifted. Like someone, somewhere, had finally called me home. The fire I left burning. There's a fire I left burning once deep in the foothills outside a chapel. No one sings in anymore. It was small, not the kind that roars or devours, just a circle of light in the darkness, like a held breath. I didn't stay to watch it fade. I left it there, quietly, because part of me hoped someone else might find it, and for a long while, I didn't think about it again. But lately I do, not as a regret, more like an echo. You see, fires are funny things. They don't have memories, not in the way people do. They consume, they give, and then they're gone. But the warmth now that stays, it lingers in the wood, in the stone nearby, in the sleeves of your coat. You carry it, even when you think you've moved on. And in a way, I've come to believe that every fire we ever lit, every kindness, every hard truth, every story whispered between dusk and sleep never really disappears. It becomes part of the ground, part of the silence. It waits. So, when I passed through that old path again, unplanned, I found myself stopping where the trees cleared just enough for sky to come through. The stones were still there, blackened a little. Moss had grown up around the edges. A few acorns had fallen where once I'd left my thoughts. And without really deciding to, I knelt. Not in prayer, not exactly, just in acknowledgement. Sometimes, the most sacred moments don't need names. I ran my hand across the ash and found something strange. A piece of charred wood that hadn't quite burned through. It looked like a cradle, the center hollow, as if it had been holding something. And I remembered that night not just the fire, but what I'd whispered into it. I'd told the flames I didn't know who I was anymore. I'd asked them to carry that confusion up into the wind, to scatter it somewhere no one could find. And maybe they had, because now, kneeling there, I didn't feel like a man running. I felt like a man returned not just to a place, but to himself. There's a difference between being lost and being quiet. I used to confuse the two, thought that if no one was calling your name, it meant you were forgotten. But sometimes, quiet is just what comes before a new kind of sound. The slow unfolding of a different rhythm, one that isn't driven by survival or fear, but by listening. As I sat beside the old fire circle, I heard other things I'd missed before. Birds I couldn't name, the creak of a tree shifting with age, my own breath, steady, and beneath it all something else. Maybe not a voice, maybe not even words, but a pull, like gravity turned inside out, like the earth gently inviting you to be part of it again, not as a stranger, but as kin. I stayed there for hours, not to mourn, to remember, to let the warmth of who I'd been begin to bloom again like a coal kept under a coat too long. And when I finally rose, I did something I hadn't done since I was a boy. I sang, just a single verse of an old song my mother used to hum while stirring beans. The kind of tune that rises slow and falls gentle, like rocking a child who isn't yours, but still deserves peace. The wind didn't answer, but it didn't interrupt either. And that's how I knew I was allowed to sing again. The day I forgave my silence. There are certain days that arrive without knocking. No grand sky, no thunder, no reason for you to rise early or move slower. Just another morning where the world spins the same and the birds do their ordinary song. But something is different, so quiet you almost miss it. That's how it was the day I forgave my silence. It began with a sound I hadn't heard in years. The creak of a screen door I hadn't passed through since I was a boy. I'd returned to a house that no longer had family in it. Not out of duty, or even nostalgia, but because the wind had whispered something familiar, and I'd followed it. Like I always did now. The porch was still there. Sagging, yes, but holding, and that old screen door. It let out a sigh when I opened it. Not a groan of protest, but something gentler. Like it remembered the weight of a boy who used to lean against it and listen to the rain. I stepped inside. Dust had gathered where voices used to live. Light slanted across the wooden floor in thick, golden stripes. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon and smoke, though no one had baked there in a decade. And in the corner, by the window that looked out onto the empty garden, sat the old chair, not the rocking one, the other one, the small woven one, where my mother used to tie her apron and pray under her breath before dinner. She never prayed loudly. She said God already knew her worries. Her prayers were more like reminders to herself that the quiet mattered. Too, I walked over, sat down, and then I let the silence happen. Not the heavy kind, not the one that keeps you from speaking the truth. This was the silence that held space, the kind that arrives when you no longer feel the need to defend your absence, or explain your journey, or hide the way the road reshaped your voice. I'd spent so many years afraid of what my silence meant that it made me lesser, cowardly, broken, that by not speaking, I'd lost my chance at being whole again. But sitting there, in that chair, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe. My silence wasn't a failure. It was part of the healing. Because sometimes, words aren't ready. Sometimes, the world needs you to listen longer than you speak, to gather enough light before you try to name the shadows. And the quiet I carried wasn't emptiness. It was protection. It was grief with no place to land. It was love I didn't know how to say out loud. I closed my eyes, felt the warmth of the sun through the window, heard the creak of the house as it settled into itself. And for the first time, I didn't flinch from the stillness. I leaned into it. And that's when I remembered something Elira once said, not in a moment of drama, just while we were peeling carrots by candlelight. She'd said, "You don't owe the world your voice until it's ready, but when it is, don't be afraid to let it crack." At the time, I'd nodded, pretending to understand, but only now, years later, did the truth of it bloom in my chest. I spoke, not loudly, not for anyone to hear, just a whisper, a breath finally given shape. "I'm here." That's all I said. But it was enough, because in that moment, I was no longer speaking to the room, or to ghosts, or even to God. I was speaking to the part of me I'd abandoned the day I first chose silence over truth. And for the first time, that part answered, not in words, but in peace. The candle still flickering. There's a candle on the windowsill in the house where I sometimes rest now. It's not fancy, just a stub of wax in a jelly jar. Its wick curled like a question mark. Most nights, I don't light it. Just seeing it there is enough. A quiet presence, a soft kind of company. But tonight, it's burning, not because I need the light, but because the moment calls for it. And if you're still listening, then maybe you're the reason I lit it. You see, some stories don't end. Not really. They just slow down into stillness, like a rocking chair easing its sway, or the last note of a hymn held just a second longer than expected. This story, the one I've been whispering from porches, fire circles, and the edge of sleep was never about what I did in the shadows. It was about what I carried, and how, somewhere along the way, I stopped running and started remembering. There's something beautiful about remembering not the sharp edges of fact, but the warmth beneath it, the smell of burnt wood on flannel, the way someone once tucked a note in your pocket without saying a word, the moment your hands stopped shaking because someone held them steady. Memory isn't a list, it's a fire. And mine, it still flickers. I think about Elira sometimes, not in the aching way anymore. Now, she's a warmth at my back, a breeze through trees that I recognize before I see them. I don't know where she is or if she still walks this earth, but I know this: she lit a flame in me, and even if we were just two lost songs passing through each other's verses, that melody changed me. I think about the chapel, the letter, the orchard, the stranger who called me home. I think about my mother's quiet prayers, and the way my boots sound different on wooden floors than on gravel roads. How every silence I feared became a place I could finally rest in. And I think about you. Yes, you, sitting there now, wrapped in a blanket or drifting beneath the hush of sleep. Maybe you don't think this story is yours. Maybe you clicked on it by accident, looking for something to pass the time until the dark turned light. But here you are, still listening. And that means this story is yours, because we all carry a little fire inside. Sometimes it dims, sometimes we forget it's even there, but it never truly goes out, not if we keep something kind nearby. A memory, a hand, a candle. And if tonight has meant anything, let it be this: you are not alone, not in your quiet, not in your remembering, not in the long, winding road it takes to come back to yourself. So I'll leave this here: the flame, the voice, the breath between sentences. You can pick it up when you're ready, or let it sit until the time feels soft enough. But either way, the candle still flickers. And it always will. There's a truth I've come to believe, not learned in books or shouted from pulpits, but felt in the marrow of quiet nights. We are all, at some point, both the flame and the shadow. We hide to survive. We burn to feel alive. And somewhere between the silence and the spark, we remember what it means to be human. This story wasn't about a man with a blade. It was about a man learning how to carry warmth again. A man who thought silence was safety, but found out it could also be forgiveness. Who wandered through forgotten orchards and empty chapels, only to find that home was not a place, but a moment of stillness within himself. He learned that the past doesn't disappear. It softens, and that every memory, every regret, every love that left too soon becomes kindling. If you let it, he discovered that grief doesn't always need to be solved. Sometimes it just needs to be held, and perhaps the deepest truth of all, that no one, not the lost, not the weary, not the quiet ones, needs to carry their fire alone. So as this story fades into your own breath, I invite you to pause, not to find answers, but to feel what still glows within you. A letter never sent, a song once hummed, a porch light that still flickers waiting for you to return. And if you've made it here, all the way to the edge of this quiet tale, thank you for listening, for remembering, for holding space. And now, I ask, what fire have you carried, silently, all these years? Leave a candle in the comments if you're still burning, or share a word, a memory, even a breath. Together, let's keep the warmth alive, one quiet story at a time.